The United States, while historically an oil-producing nation, has faced a complex mix of economic, environmental, political, and technological factors that influence its decision to rely on both domestic oil production and imported oil. While the U.S. does pump significant amounts of its own oil, it does not completely rely on domestic production for various reasons. Understanding why the U.S. doesn't solely depend on its own oil production involves delving into the intricacies of the global oil market, historical production trends, policy decisions, environmental concerns, and the economic considerations tied to the energy sector. Oil is a globally traded commodity, which means that its prices are determined not just by local production, but also by global supply and demand dynamics. The U.S., as part of the global economy, is deeply integrated into these markets. Oil prices fluctuate based on geopolitical events, supply disruptions in other countries, and agreements within organizations like the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Even if the U.S. were to ramp up domestic production, the price of oil in the U.S. would still be impacted by these global factors. For example, a conflict in the Middle East or a natural disaster affecting oil infrastructure in another region can lead to spikes in global oil prices, which would impact the U.S. domestic market. As a result, it often makes more economic sense to import oil from countries where extraction and production are cheaper. The U.S. may export its own oil while importing oil from countries like Saudi Arabia or Canada, depending on pricing and logistical considerations. The U.S. has significant oil reserves, but not all of these reserves are easily accessible or economically viable to extract. Much of the country's oil reserves are locked in shale formations, tar sands, or deepwater offshore locations, which require advanced technology and higher costs to extract compared to traditional oil sources. These methods, such as hydraulic fracturing, fracking, or deepwater drilling, are expensive and resource-intensive, making it less attractive to rely solely on domestic production when cheaper alternatives exist abroad. Moreover, the U.S. has a policy of managing its strategic petroleum reserves. By importing oil, the U.S. can conserve its own reserves, ensuring that they are available for future use or in case of emergencies, such as major supply disruptions. This reserve management strategy is a key part of national security planning, ensuring that the country has enough oil to meet its needs in the event of geopolitical crises or natural disasters that might affect global supply chains. One of the primary reasons the U.S. does not rely solely on its own oil is because of the cost of production. Oil extraction in the U.S., especially from unconventional sources like shale or offshore drilling, is significantly more expensive than in some other countries where oil is more readily accessible. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Venezuela can produce oil at a much lower cost due to their geographic and geological advantages. For U.S. companies, it often makes sense to import cheaper oil rather than produce it domestically, especially when global oil prices are low. The oil industry, like any other, is driven by the need to remain competitive and profitable. During periods of low oil prices, U.S. oil production often slows down because it becomes less profitable, while imports increase from countries with lower production costs. Additionally, the U.S. refines oil not just for domestic consumption, but also for export. The type of crude oil that the U.S. produces, especially from shale oil, is often lighter and sweeter than the heavy crude oil that many U.S. refineries are designed to process. As a result, the U.S. exports its lighter crude oil and imports heavier crude oil, which is more suitable for its refineries. This complex interplay between production and refining capacity further explains why the U.S. continues to import oil despite having substantial domestic reserves. Environmental concerns also play a significant role in limiting the full-scale extraction of U.S. oil reserves. Oil extraction, particularly from unconventional sources like shale or deepwater drilling, has significant environmental impacts. Hydraulic fracturing, for example, has been linked to groundwater contamination, methane leaks, and increased seismic activity in areas where it is heavily used. Offshore drilling poses the risk of catastrophic oil spills, as was seen in the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which caused severe environmental damage and economic losses for the surrounding region. Due to these environmental risks, there has been increasing pressure from environmental groups and the public to limit domestic oil production, particularly in sensitive areas like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, and offshore areas. The U.S. government has responded with regulations and policies designed to mitigate these environmental risks. For instance, the Biden administration has taken steps to limit new oil and gas drilling on federal lands, while promoting clean energy alternatives and reducing the country's reliance on fossil fuels. The transition to renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, and biofuels has been a growing priority in U.S. energy policy. While oil remains a crucial part of the U.S. energy mix, there is a concerted effort to reduce the country's carbon footprint and transition towards more sustainable energy sources, which further limits the expansion of domestic oil production. Geopolitics plays a significant role in why the U.S. continues to import oil despite having domestic production capabilities. By importing oil, the U.S. is able to foster strategic alliances with key oil-producing nations, particularly in the Middle East. These alliances are important not just for ensuring a stable supply of oil, but also for broader geopolitical objectives, such as maintaining regional stability, combating terrorism, and containing the influence of rival powers like China and Russia. Moreover, by participating in the global oil market, the U.S. is able to exert influence over global energy prices and policies. For example, the U.S. has frequently used sanctions or trade agreements to influence the behavior of oil-producing nations. Sanctions on countries like Iran or Venezuela often target their oil industries, and the U.S.'s ability to import oil from a diverse range of countries allows it to mitigate any disruptions from these sanctions. Additionally, maintaining a diversified energy supply, which includes both domestic production and imports, helps to insulate the U.S. from potential supply shocks. If domestic production were to be disrupted by natural disasters, technical failures, or political decisions, the U.S. could still rely on imported oil to meet its energy needs. While the U.S. has made significant advances in oil extraction technology, there are still technological constraints that limit the full-scale exploitation of domestic oil reserves. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling have made it possible to access previously inaccessible oil deposits, but these techniques are expensive and have diminishing returns over time. As oil wells deplete, it becomes increasingly difficult and costly to extract the remaining oil, which reduces the long-term viability of relying solely on domestic production. In addition, the U.S. energy infrastructure is not uniformly distributed across the country. Certain regions, particularly the Gulf Coast, are well suited for oil production and refining, but other regions lack the infrastructure necessary to support large-scale oil extraction and transportation. Building new infrastructure, such as pipelines or refineries, is costly and time-consuming, and often faces opposition from local communities and environmental groups. Furthermore, the U.S. has a well-established network of oil refineries, but many of these refineries are optimized to process certain types of crude oil. As mentioned earlier, much of the oil produced domestically from shale is lighter and sweeter, while many U.S. refineries are designed to process heavier, sour crude oil. This mismatch between production and refining capacity creates the need for both imports and exports of oil to optimize refinery operations. In summary, while the United States does produce a significant amount of its own oil, there are several key reasons why it continues to import oil and does not rely solely on domestic production. The global nature of the oil market, the high cost of extracting certain domestic reserves, environmental concerns, and geopolitical considerations all play a role in shaping U.S. oil policy. Additionally, the U.S. strategy of conserving its own reserves for future use and maintaining diverse sources of oil helps ensure energy security and economic stability. The decision to import oil is not merely about the availability of domestic resources, but is also driven by broader strategic, environmental, and economic considerations. As the U.S. continues to transition towards renewable energy and reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, the dynamics of domestic oil production and imports will likely evolve, but for the foreseeable future, imported oil will remain a crucial component of the U.S. energy landscape.